I'm Caitlin Dryden, and this is Slut. I'm Caitlin Dryden, and welcome to Slut, the show where I question who is and what makes a slut. It's raining in LA today, so you may hear some fall in the background, but hopefully you enjoy it. I personally find it very relaxing. I have some candles going in here right now. I'm laying in bed, but let's get to the episode. Last fall, I was experiencing some problems with my health. I constantly felt bloated, like there was this weird knot in my lower stomach. My libido was so low, and for a slut like me, that was really unusual, and I gained weight. For years, I struggled with birth control, and I had a feeling that my hormonal ring was causing these issues. I took out the Nuva ring, and within a month, my symptoms disappeared. I began doing some research on what birth control does to your body, and I came across Lisa Hendrickson-Jack's work. Lisa is a certified fertility awareness educator, holistic reproductive health practitioner, and our guest today. A few years ago, she released The Fifth Vital Sign, a book that teaches you how to use your menstrual cycle as a vital sign by using the fertility awareness method, short for FAM. Now, most people come across the fertility awareness method when they are trying to get pregnant, but FAM can also be used as birth control. To do this, you must take your temperature every morning before you get out of bed, check your cervical mucus every day, and keep track of all of this in a chart. This is called the symptothermal method. By keeping track of your temperature and cervical mucus, you'll see what days you're fertile and infertile, then avoid sex on the days that you are fertile. Another way that you can see if you're fertile is by checking your cervical position. I don't personally do this step, but Lisa does recommend it. There are 5 main rules to using fertility awareness for birth control. Number 1, the first 5 days rule. Before ovulation, you are generally considered safe to have unprotected sex the first 5 days of your menstrual cycle, if you noticed a temperature spike 12 to 16 days prior. If you experience a cycle that was less than 25 days long, this rule then becomes the first 3 days. Number 2, the dry day. Before ovulation, you are generally considered safe to have unprotected sex the evening of every dry day, meaning a day that you don't see any cervical mucus. Number 3, temperature shift. After ovulation, you are generally considered safe to have unprotected sex the evening of the 3rd day that you record a high temperature. Number 4, peak day. After ovulation, you are considered safe to have unprotected sex the evening of the 4th day after your peak day. Number 5, double check. After ovulation, you are considered safe to have unprotected sex only after your peak day rule and your temperature shift rule both indicate that you are no longer fertile. Okay, I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I know many of you probably think I'm in the deep end here, but as Lisa will tell you, this is science-backed. If used correctly, FAM can be up to 99% effective in preventing pregnancy. Also, I don't think using fertility awareness for birth control is for everyone, especially people who are in high school and very fertile and very unreliable. But if you are someone who is looking to be more in tune with your body, have experienced problems with your birth control, and don't want to be on it anymore, I think fertility awareness is a great option to consider. Before we begin, I want to remind you to call or text your slutty stories and fantasies to 910-745-SLUT. That's 910-745-SLUT. You can listen to Lisa's podcast, Fertility Friday, wherever, and you can also find her on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Fertility Friday. Okay, sluts, I think it's time to learn something about fertility. Lisa Hendrickson-Jack is up next. Lisa, you've taught thousands of people how to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception, and health. And I want to start with the importance of knowing your cycle for health. A big focus in your work is educating people that the menstrual cycle should actually be used as a vital sign, just like your pulse or temperature. That means by tracking it, you can uncover important information about your body. Can you explain the importance of fertility awareness and what it can tell you about your health?
Yes, that's a big question. So, fertility awareness, there's, I think, different ways to define it. And so one of the ways to look at it, just from a generic standpoint, is to have a good understanding of what's happening in your cycle, to be able to tell when you're fertile, when you're not, to know when, and if you're ovulating, and even to be able to predict when your period is coming. And I think in general, I would also include having a good understanding of what actually is normal in the menstrual cycle. The majority of women kind of walking around living their lives don't really know how their cycle works. They don't really know what's normal and what's not. Period pain is so common. That's a good example. And so many women just kind of assume that it's just part of how it is. The question of why I think fertility awareness is important, I think it really does represent a fundamental part of our reproductive lives. You know, for anyone who is regularly menstruating, having to deal with birth control, if you're sexually active or trying to conceive, this is something that we always just are continually in a conversation with. And so I think it's really essential for our quality of life to have a good understanding of what's going on.
One thing that you said in your book, which really resonated with me, is that yes, you experience some pain from your period, but your period shouldn't be painful. Can you expand more on that?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to make the distinction between what is common and what would be optimal or healthy. Because I get pushback on saying that periods shouldn't be painful. And I think that that's because a good percentage of women, unfortunately, including myself, have experienced period pain. And so no one wants to think like, oh, this isn't normal. But I feel like if you think about it from the perspective that I take, which is that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, I would say that moderate to severe pain that requires medication is just not optimal. So even though it's really common, it is something we should be aware of. And in my work with women, I found that if I don't specifically ask about their pain and even ask them to rate their pain on a pain scale, often I'll have clients whose pain is pretty severe and they won't even mention it. So I think that it is really important to just keep that in mind, because when you do experience moderate to severe pain on a regular basis, a consistent basis, it can be a sign of an underlying issue. It can be a sign of something as severe as endometriosis, which is a chronic condition that can lead to, infertility. So for what it's worth, I think that it's important for us to start having a different kind of conversation about it. We're not trying to make anyone feel bad about it. It is really common to have period pain, and it's not to say it's the end of the world if you have to take some Advil. I have many times.
Me too.
But I think it's a really important, because if you can identify, okay, this isn't optimal, all of a sudden it empowers you to learn more about it and to do something about it. And so many women can experience a significant reduction or even completely get rid of their pain. Maybe not all women can get to that point if they've got a really severe case of endometriosis, but most of us can experience a significant reduction in our pain. Who doesn't want that?
What are some things, aside from using fertility awareness for conception or birth control, what are some health things that women have unveiled about themselves through your teachings and your method and the fertility awareness method?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think some of the things that you can pick up are fairly basic. If you notice that you have abnormal cervical mucus patterns, you can identify that you have an infection. I've had many conversations with clients over the years so I teach them cervical mucus charting system. And in that system, we look at the color of the mucus, how frequently we're seeing it, how much it's stretching, and we're, checking in kind of a specific way. And so another example of common but not normal or optimal would be yellow cervical mucus. So if someone has seen yellow mucus a lot and it's just their norm, then of course they just think, well, isn't everyone's mucus yellow? But I've had a number of clients who, and they're not itchy. They don't have any overt signs of infection. But when I see yellow mucus, given my training, I know that it can be a sign of infection. So that I encourage them to get that checked out. And 9 times out of 10, it's a sign of an infection. Not necessarily something, overly severe, but wouldn't you want to know if you had BV or some fungal infection, right? And then if we take it further, so, I've had clients who, let's say, they have abnormal bleeding. I mean, that can mean a whole lot of things. But if I give you a couple specific examples, I've had a couple of clients who, let's say they've had a miscarriage, and then, a couple days later or a couple weeks later, they start bleeding. In those situations, I encourage them to go to the doctor. No self-diagnosis, right? And I've had a number of clients for whom that information has led them to find out that they had retained tissue. And I've seen a similar thing happen post-abortion.
I want to dig deeper on something that you started talking about, and that's cervical mucus. And cervical mucus is not taught to us. We only focus on periods when we're learning about the menstrual cycle. So what is cervical mucus and what are the different types of it?
Well, so cervical fluid is essentially, I use the word fluid and mucus interchangeably, but our cervix, essentially those are mucous membranes, and they're producing this fluid that has a high content of water and it has a number of other components to it. And what's interesting about cervical fluid, as some of your audience may know, is it's linked to fertility because of its ability to support sperm. So contrary to what we're all told, I know I was told when I was growing up that you could get pregnant every single day. There's only a small window of fertility where you can actually conceive. And so when you have your period and then you start approaching, when your period's done and you start approaching ovulation, from a scientific standpoint, there's a 6-day window where conception can happen. And that coincides with this production of cervical fluid. And so as you approach ovulation, your ovaries are developing these follicles, and one follicle is eventually going to ovulate in a healthy cycle. And as that happens, you're making estrogen, and that estrogen is what triggers the production of cervical fluid. And so when you're just at that perfect time, approaching ovulation, you're making the cervical fluid, and it has the ability to keep the sperm alive for up to 5 days. So it's all kind of great timing. So if you're trying to get pregnant, I would encourage you to pay attention to your cervical mucus and use that as your primary sign. When you see the mucus, it can look like creamy white hand lotion, and it can also look like stretchy kind of raw egg whites, where if you were to, pick it up and stretch it between your fingers, it would form a thread. If you're not on contraceptives, you've probably noticed it before if you're ovulating, where you go to the bathroom and maybe you have to wipe a bunch of times. It feels kind of like slippery. Or you wipe and it's like super slippery. And like I always joke, like your hand hitting the back of the toilet. So those are all different ways that it can show up. But there's 2 main types. So the one type is our G mucus, gestogenic mucus. And so that is produced under the influence of progesterone. And then there's E-type mucus, which is produced under the influence of estrogen. So the interesting thing about G mucus is we don't really observe it by itself, because when we have that G mucus, it's a plug. So it plugs the cervix. And on those days, we would have what we call dry days. So in a healthy cycle, you would expect to have mostly dry days outside of that fertile window. So you'd expect to have your period, a few dry days, and a dry day is simply a day you're not observing cervical fluid. So you'd have a few dry days before that fertile window starts, before you kind of get into that follicular development pre-ovulatory phase there. And then once you ovulate, that's when you actually produce a significant amount of progesterone in your cycle. That progesterone is what shuts down our mucus production. So in a typical healthy cycle, after you've ovulated, you're going to see either your cervical mucus just dry up and it's going to be dry days, or you'll see a significant shift where even if you still see a little bit of mucus, it's mostly gone. And so when you have those dry days, you can just picture like a plug. Like there's nothing there. The sperm can't get through. And then the E-type mucus is what we actually observe. So when you're noticing that lotiony type cervical fluid, whether you're, wiping when you go to the bathroom, whether you're checking for it, if you're checking internally, or whether you have something that you're observing in your underwear, the creamy white lotiony type mucus, as well as the clear stretchy, those are both that kind of estrogenic mucus. So when you have that mucus, the sperm can live in there for up to 5 days. And so that's why I mean, I could talk about it for an hour, but I'll leave it there. That's why we consider it to be fertile.
We're going to get into using fertility awareness for birth control right now, but the thing that I want to just really drive home before we move on to that is that your body makes your vagina a unsafe place for sperm when you are not having this mucus present. But on the days that you do have this mucus present, a sperm can live in there up to 5 days. So you could have sex on Monday and have some of that mucus, and the sperm could live in there until Friday when ovulation does happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us have heard that kind of stat, like sperm can live in your body for 5 days, but there's no context given. So I think most women just think it's like all the time. And so when you learn about fertility awareness, and you learn how the cycle works, you start to understand that it's only during that fertile window when sperm can survive. So you're absolutely right. Outside of that window, your vagina is very hostile to sperm. It's kind of like a sperm killing machine. And so I mentioned that G mucus plug, which means that the sperm have nowhere to go. So I like silly analogies. And one of my favorite analogies for that is like a nightclub. So if your cervix was a nightclub, when you are in that fertile window, like the bouncer's off duty, like, you know, the sperm can come in, like, hey guys, whatever. But on those dry days outside of that window, the bouncer is in front. No one's getting in. And outside of the fact that they have nowhere to go, there's a block. The vagina itself is acidic. So our vagina is naturally acidic. That's part of our natural defense to infections, yeast infections, things like that. And interestingly, a grown woman's vagina has been shown to be more acidic than, you know, a young girl. So it is this kind of defense mechanism that we have. And so outside of that fertile window, the sperm die, you know, within minutes or at most maybe an hour or so. And this is why we can use fertility awareness for birth control, because contrary to what we've been taught, there are times in our cycle where it is impossible, and I don't use that word lightly, literally impossible to conceive. The key to using the method correctly is to really identify when that window is so that you don't accidentally have sex on a day or on purpose, but whichever one, so you don't have sex on a day where pregnancy is actually possible.
I'm curious, when I first started using fertility awareness, I was telling a friend about it, and she was like, well, how do you explain the unfortunate situation when some young girls get pregnant and they haven't had their period yet?
Well, I feel like there's a fairly simple explanation. It's just that was her first ovulation. If that would be highly, highly unfortunate, but it would just be that kind of timing. And to make matters worse or more complicated or whatever, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things, when you are in that ovulation window, there's research to show that we emit pheromones that attract the opposite sex. So this is a very unfortunate example that I'm sharing this information in, right? The thought of someone being, I mean, maybe it was consensual, but whatever the case is, in many ways, and of course, it's not the only explanation, but, you know, if there was that one time that you were going to have sex, I think that there is an argument to be made that maybe it would be more likely that it would be in the window, whether because your arousal was higher or whether because again, independent scientific studies show that members of the opposite sex tend to be more attracted to you because of these pheromones that you're emitting around that time.
Interesting. So now that we understand what cervical mucus is, I want to talk about how to use fertility awareness to prevent pregnancy. And like we said before, this may come as a shock to some listeners, and it surprised me when I first learned it, but you can't get pregnant every day of your cycle. So how can you use fertility awareness for birth control?
What I teach my clients is essentially it comes in stages. So in a nutshell, you know, you have to learn how your cycle works and learn to be able to identify which days are fertile and which days are infertile. And for anyone who's never heard this information before, it's like, what are these people talking about? So this is science-based. There's a study, the most commonly quoted study, Petra Frank Herman and her colleagues, and it showed that when used correctly, the symptothermal method is up to 99.4% effective. And so this is not the kind of thing where we're kind of like guesstimating like, oh, last month, I think I ovulated on this day. And so I'm good today. It's a specific system and a method. So modern fertility awareness-based methods, they're focused on that daily observation. So we're never guessing where you are in the cycle. We have the tools and the understanding to know where you are and to be able to identify in real time which days are fertile and which days are not. So I said that from a scientific standpoint, there's a 6-day window of fertility in the cycle. But if you're going to use it as a birth control method, you actually have to tack on some additional days around that so that you're safe, so that we meet the scientific, we meet essentially what is required to get that 99.4% efficacy. I think the most important part that I teach my clients is that fertility awareness isn't an IUD. like the copper IUD is a good example. If you get a copper IUD, you're good that day. There was no class required or education or anything. So fertility awareness isn't like that. You have to learn, and it does take some time. So it's kind of like learning to drive a car. You don't just get in the car the first time and then you're good to go. When you're learning, you want to take the first cycle, whether you're working with an instructor or not, to learn and to not have unprotected sex at all. And then if you are learning by yourself, most educators recommend a minimum of 3 full cycles of charting before you start using the method as birth control, so that you give yourself time to learn your own cycle, what's going on, and that you also give yourself time to learn the rules. So I would say 3 to 6 cycles if you're learning on your own. And then if you're learning with an instructor, then that becomes a shorter period of time. If we divide your cycle in half, the only time that you can get pregnant is in the first half. So it's only in the pre-ovulatory phase where pregnancy is possible. And the reason is because it's in the pre-ovulatory phase that you ovulate. So as long as there's a possibility of ovulation, there's a chance of conception. But once you do ovulate and you confirm that, if that egg is not fertilized, it disintegrates or is reabsorbed within 12 to 24 hours. Gone. So that means that in the post-ovulatory phase, it is actually impossible to get pregnant. Now, that might be hard to hear, press the rewind. So it's actually impossible, literally scientifically impossible, because if there's no egg, you literally can't get pregnant. So the first step is to be able to confirm when you ovulated. And I teach my clients the cross-check method. So we are confirming with cervical mucus, we're confirming with temperature, and we've learned all the rules. So we know what to do if we're unsure. Basically, if you're unsure, you consider yourself fertile.
Yeah.
You learn all those things. And once you get that down, then I do recommend that my clients use a pre-ovulatory last infertile day calculation alongside their mucus to increase overall efficacy, because that is the method that is used in that same study that I quoted with the 99.4% efficacy. So I teach a double check pre-ovulatory method as well as a cross check post-ovulatory, so that for both parts of this window, we always have 2 signs to compare. I wanted to share that because I want people listening to know, this isn't just this random thing, that we're doing. This is actually a system. And it's not for everybody. Some women listening are probably why?
Yeah.
My birth control is working just fine. But the reality is that even the research tells us that 50% of women aren't happy on the pill. They have side effects. And the most common side effects are depression, the libido. Some women have painful sex. Some women have anxiety, panic attacks. It's real out there.
I've experienced all of that.
That's horrible. So there's a huge group of women out there who are unsatisfied. And it breaks my heart when I think of all the women who I've spoken to who had no idea that fertility awareness was even an option. And they're going from birth control option, that this pill to that pill to this IUD to this thing, hating them all, having different side effects, trying to find the one that works, and feeling just lost and trapped and oh, I guess I just have to try another. That's horrible. So for anyone who's why would you go through all of that? I mean, when you get past that learning curve and you understand how to use it, it means that you have a birth control method that works with no side effects.
And for people listening, the show is called Slut. So obviously we may have some horny listeners who are like, what? I can't have sex for 7 days of my cycle. And to that, I say I've been doing fertility awareness actually for a full year this month. I found you and your book this time last year, and it really helped me get more connected to my body. And for me, I find it helps actually be more adventurous with sex is when you don't have to just have like penis and vagina sex like every day. It lets you explore more and explore different kinds of sex with your partner. So I have found it like benefiting my sex life in a different way than you would have thought.
That's such a great point. And I feel like there's pros and cons to everything. And so we all have to find what's going to work best for us. And so I think one of the benefits for a lot of women is that when they come off the pill, they have a libido again.
Yeah.
So it's like, here we are talking about all this sex that we're having, right? Because we're on this birth control method that allows us not to get pregnant all the time. But there are plenty of women who it messes with their libido to the point that they don't really want it, or it reduces their sensation. I mean, this is not the case for everybody, but for some women. So across the board, oral contraceptives significantly lower free testosterone. And that can have all kinds of effects. And one of those effects can be painful sex and also a reduced sensation and reduced capacity for orgasm, or the orgasms that you experience aren't as intense. And if you've been on the pill since you were 13, how would you know? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't know. So I'm not trying to like ruin everyone's day. And I myself used the pill for a period of time. This is not about judgment. This is not about any of that. It's about information. I'm big on information because you should know, because probably no one told you that. And for me, it's about options. So absolutely, for some women, it's like, I have a libido, like it feels better. I'm enjoying this a whole lot more. I've been able to explore.
Also, I was dry on birth control. Yep. That was a big thing. And it all has come back. I thought there was something wrong for a while.
Well, and that's a good point too, because again, the lack of testosterone has been shown to thin like one of the scariest stats in the book, like the stat that I get the most, like, what? is the stat that the pill has been shown to shrink the vulvar tissues, including the clitoris and the labia. And also, I mean, you would think to yourself, why does a 21-year-old have low libido and vaginal dryness? And it's because the pill shuts down ovarian function, and the ovaries are actually what make our estrogen and progesterone. And it's that estrogen, and progesterone that make us nice and juicy and wet and all that stuff down there. So yeah, plenty of women struggle with those issues. So again, this isn't about like what's like an ultimate, like this is good or this is bad. But your initial question or comment was like, oh, there's 7 days, like there's all these days I won't be able to have sex. So people make different choices. So some couples will choose actually to abstain. They just won't have anything. Other couples, like like yourself, what you mentioned, will have alternative sex, meaning no penis and vagina, but there's a lot of things on the menu still. And so that can be an enjoyable way to connect. And obviously, especially for the female, it can result in a lot more like fun.
It has resulted in more fun. I can say that.
For a lot of people, I feel like that's like a really big bonus. And, there's still other options. There's still barrier methods. And I know everyone isn't a fan of all the barrier methods. But again, every couple gets to decide. So I have plenty of clients who are happy using condoms or a diaphragm or a combination or withdrawal. I know that's like
there's a lot of conversation.
We could talk about that if you want. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying like a lot of people do it. So I've just been in the field for long enough. I've talked to enough couples. Like a lot of people use withdrawal. They're just like, don't talk about it. It's like, oh, use withdrawal, like under their breath, right? But anyways, there's options, and that's the point.
Hold on, sluts. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and rate it 5 stars wherever you're listening. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel @SlutPodcast, even if you don't listen there. It really helps the show. Also, make sure you're following @SlutPodcast on Instagram and @SlutPod on TikTok. But on TikTok, the L is an I, so that I'm no longer shadow banned. Please engage with my content in any way you can by liking, saving, commenting, sharing it. Engaging with my posts help reach more sluts like us. Also, if you have a slutty story or fantasy, call or text 910-745-SLUT. That's 910-745-SLUT, and tell me about it to be featured in the last episode of the season. All right, sluts, let's get back to Lisa. You said this once, quote, The goal of fertility awareness is never to predict ovulation and base your decisions on what happened last cycle. It's always to base your decisions on what's happening right now. And that is what really distinguishes fertility awareness from the rhythm method. And before we move on to using fertility awareness to conceive, can you just expand more about that and really highlight the importance of listening to your body in the moment to make decisions today?
That's such an important piece of it. And I think that it's hard sometimes to get out of that mindset. You know, even when you've discovered fertility awareness and you're totally on board and you're excited about it, we still want to see those patterns. We still want to know what day we ovulate. And if we don't ovulate on the same day the next cycle, we still get a little like, wait, what? I mean, and that's not necessarily our fault. That's a result of years and years and years of being drilled about the 28-day cycle and the 14-day ovulation and all of that. And in order to make fertility awareness work for you, whether you're trying to avoid or conceive, but let's just, stick with avoiding, you really have to get into that kind of like now mentality. And the reason is that every cycle is new and you have to be open to whatever happens and however that unfolds. And what I always say to my clients is that in any cycle, you could ovulate earlier or later than you have before. You could have a different kind of presentation. You could have cervical fluid for several days, and then you could assume that you've ovulated if it goes away. But if you didn't confirm ovulation, that could be what we call a double peak. And then you could have like more mucus 3 days later and then ovulate. So with fertility awareness, I think one of the things that distinguishes it from other methods is that it's an entirely user-based method. So going back to the IUD example, if you get an IUD, like that's it. Like you don't have to do anything. Yeah. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying the effectiveness is based on the actual device. So the only time that there's a failure is when the device fails. And I mean, there's benefits to this because you don't have to remember anything, right? With fertility awareness, it's the opposite. Because it's really based on you. So it's to the degree that you understand and that you are following the rules, it's entirely based on you. For some people, that's terrifying. Too much pressure. But for others, like myself included, and probably for yourself, it's actually the opposite. It's like, I get to control this. Like, this is actually within my control. Maybe I'm a control freak. Maybe that's why I like this so much. But I look at it in a different way in that respect.
And I came across fertility awareness after, feeling at a standstill with all of the different birth controls I used. I had an IUD for a few years, and then I stopped using birth control entirely because I was just celibate for a year. I was intentionally celibate. It was during the pandemic. And then I thought that I could just chart and use, I didn't even know it was the rhythm method, but I downloaded an app. And then immediately I got pregnant. And so I learned the hard way of, looking at past cycles and just thinking on a 14-day schedule that doesn't work. And then I went back on birth control. I was using the Nuva ring, and that really didn't help me. I noticed I was getting a lot of bloating, vaginal dryness, no libido, and then I gained a bunch of weight on the birth control as well. And then that's when I was like, I have to get off this. And that's how I came to fertility awareness. And so if you have a birth control that works for you, go on with your bad self. That is great. You should use that. But if you are somebody who wants a different method and is really in tune with your body, I think this is or you would like to be more in tune with your body, this is a great method to use. So how can people use fertility awareness to get pregnant?
Mm-hmm. So you can do the thing in reverse where you assume you ovulate on day 14 and like have sex on that day. And I think plenty of people do that. Like they just make sure to have sex on day 14. And if you're ovulating on day 12 or you're ovulating on day 22 or something, then you could miss your window cycle after cycle. So I think this is something that you can kind of look back to what we talked about already. There's a window. So if you don't have sex at any point in that window, conception can't happen. You're inadvertently using the method for birth control. I've worked with clients who, let's say their partner was out of town for that week and there was no sex in the window, but there was sex all around the window. And often they're still thinking, there's still a chance because we had all the sex. Not understanding that, no, it doesn't matter how much sex you have. You have you give sex 100 times, like in the luteal. Like it's nothing.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
No egg. So that's key. But then when you're working, like for me, with clients who are timing sex correctly and are having sex at the correct time, cycle after cycle after cycle, and not conceiving, it really shows you that, okay, there's more going on here. I think a lot of women discover fertility awareness at that time because they're just like, I'm having all this sex. Like, I thought this would be easy. Like, they just tell me to fall into bed and I should I should be with child. So I think a lot of women then, they discover charting and, for better or for worse, they're discovering like the rhythmy apps that tell them to have sex on day 14. But many of them then discover the rabbit hole and all of that. So that's a good first step. For me, in my work, because I look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, I think that it's also really helpful to then take it a step further, because if you're not conceiving, there's a problem. We should be looking at his sperm quality. And that's something that I go into in a lot of detail, in the book, because I had to ask that question. I'm seeing the sex happen at the right time all the time. What's up? And then we can look at her cycle from the health standpoint and see if there's any clues as to what's going on hormonally or what some of the challenges are. So I think there's a lot of implications and applications for using the cycle for conception.
I'm 27, and many listeners of the show are also getting to an age where they're considering if they want to have a kid and when. So I'm curious, how early should women come off hormonal birth control when they are trying to have a baby?
So I don't know if my answer is controversial, but I'm 40 at this point. So I guess take that also into consideration, because the older you get, I think your perspectives change a little bit. I think that it is important for, in your age group, to start considering their type of birth control. So when you get to that late 20s, early 30s, if you have taken it or if you're currently on it, I just want you to think about, how old were you when you went on it and what were the reasons why? So for some of you, it could have been because you had irregular cycles, or because you had painful periods, or because you had acne, or because you were having sex, whatever the reason, right? So then think of where you are now and ask yourself if those reasons still apply today. And if you were starting from scratch today, never taken birth control, would you use the same reasoning? Would you be on the same thing? And it's totally fine if the answer is yes, I would. I'm just saying we should think about it. So to answer your question, what a lot of women don't know, because if you ask your doctor, they'll just tell you, well, when you come off birth control, you'll just get pregnant right away. So a lot of women are told, just wait until you're ready and just come off of it. But what the research tells us, it doesn't tell us that you can't get pregnant right away. It's possible. Many women come off the birth control pill and get pregnant right away. Some get pregnant while they're still on it.
I know some people.
Yes, exactly. We can all think of a few. But what I do know, the research is really interesting. So when you are trying to conceive, let's say if it's not happening, at some point you might do a fertility workup. And one of the things that they look at is that they look at those ovarian reserve parameters. The reason I'm saying this is because everyone on, hormonal birth control, like those oral contraceptives and the combined birth control methods, like the ring or the patch or, what have you. So they are known to lower the ovarian reserve parameters while you're on it. And it takes about 6 to 7 months, even up to a year, for those parameters to fully normalize. Now, does that mean you can't get pregnant? No, but this isn't like a math test. Like if you want to have a baby, you would think that we would be aiming to optimize, not just to get pregnant, but to optimize it, to try to, do everything we can so that baby can have the best start. So from that standpoint, I think that it's a better strategy, if you can, to consider at some point within, I would say, a minimum of a year, if you never had any cycle problems. If you had really irregular cycles and then you went on the pill and you're like, sweet, they're always 28 days now. Like, no, they're not. Like when you come off the pill, you don't know what they're going to be like because the pill didn't give you a cycle. For anyone who didn't know, the pill shuts down ovarian function and gives you what's called withdrawal bleed, which is an artificial bleed as a direct result of the hormones. So like you take your, 28-day pill pack and then you have the sugar pills in between and whatever. So that's not an actual period. And so when you come off the pill, you're going to see what's really going on. And so if you fall in that category, I recommend 18 months to 2 years. Again, if you can. And the reason is because what if it takes 6 months for you to get, it's not normal for it to take that long, but if you were in that risk category, it could.
What I'm hearing from you is patience and planning. So depending on what you want from your life, it's a good time to start thinking about the role hormonal birth control plays in your life and what you want to do to move forward. And I have 2 questions from listeners. The first is, what apps do you recommend for tracking fertility? And I actually have the answer to this question. I think it's Read Your Body and Kindara. But there is a caveat, and you talk a lot about this, is that you need to turn off the predictor on the app. Can you explain what the predictor is and why it's important to do this?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different apps, and I recommend Read Your Body for my clients. And I don't even know if Read Your Body has a predictor because Read Your Body is kind of one that was designed within the fertility awareness space. So it's very much like for fertility awareness users like me, we've drank the Kool-Aid. This is right. This is the one. But Kindara used to be my go-to. And one of the things I did appreciate about that was that you could turn the predictor off. So to answer your question, a lot of the apps that are not fertility awareness based, but with the period trackers or whatever, I mean, their kind of main thing is this predictive thing. So whether they put little stars around your ovulation or shade something. And so they're telling you, okay, we think you're going to ovulate on this day or whatever. And what I always say is the apps don't know what's in your panties today, right? only you do. So what I have found is that for someone who's charting and they're trying to learn fertility awareness, it can cause them to doubt themselves. And, the app is telling them they're supposed to see something today and they're not. And so they start worrying if there's something wrong with them. And so it depends on the person and what they're doing and what their goals are. If someone is legitimately I want to try fertility awareness, I want to start charting, that's when I don't recommend using the apps, because I feel like at the beginning stage of your journey, it just causes a lot of confusion and self-doubt. And maybe I sound like I'm being extra, but it really does. And then I would absolutely never recommend making decisions based on whatever it's telling you. Never.
Paying attention to your body. Where we go back to that, you need to listen to what your body is saying today. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, but today.
Because apps can be wrong. And especially if you just started, it doesn't know anything.
So the second question is a little bit of a switch. Do you have any recommendations for endometriosis that are more than just popping up an IUD?
Yeah, that's a complex conversation. I mean, I actually just interviewed a really interesting and experienced endometrial surgeon who works out of Atlanta. And that was really eye-opening to see how significant of a condition this can be, because you often think of endometriosis and period pain and kind of being located in the abdomen. And it can be located anywhere in the body. It can be located on the lungs. It can be in the brain. It can be all over the place. And then there's different degrees. So some women have endometriosis and obviously have a lot of pain and a lot of different symptoms related to that. And then others don't necessarily have pain. Some of the key signs that make endometriosis different as it relates to period pain is that when women have endo, often that pain is not only during the period itself, but they might experience pain at other times in the cycle. So there might be random other times when they're not bleeding that they also have pain and discomfort. Pain with sex is a pretty significant one. It can negatively affect the bladder and bowel, and it's often associated with gut health and gut issues as well. And so there's different interactions. And obviously, if the pain is incredibly severe, a lot of women are put on the pill, right? Or they're told to do an ID. And for some women, that doesn't even get rid of the pain. They're still having to take their pain medications even on the pill itself. So those are some of the signs. I think the first step is really to educate yourself about the condition, to learn about potential sources of inflammation, to really look at some of the triggers that can be associated with it, being, regular conventional dairy, the kind of typical sources of inflammation, industrial seed oils. So that's what I call them. Most people call them vegetable oils, but industrial seed oils like canola and soy and all that kind of stuff. Look at what you're eating, all the processed food, all the sugar. There's a lot of things that we eat all the time that are inflammatory. And it's hard. Those types of changes are the hardest. We're all used to doing what we're used to doing. Incorporating anti-inflammatory foods, start learning a little bit about some of the supplements that can be helpful to reduce inflammation, whether that's magnesium or curcumin, turmeric. zinc. There's a lot of different potential things. One of the more controversial things that I talk about is, vaginal steaming, but there's certain abdominal therapy modalities where some women do experience a significant reduction in their pain. So if you've never heard about Mercier therapy or Vigo therapy, it's like a concentrated kind of abdominal therapy. So it's kind of like a massage, but I feel like it's more than that. It's like targeted in those areas, and those types of things can potentially break up adhesions. And so there's different things to consider. And then if you were put on the pill for those reasons and you're scared to come off, then I wouldn't recommend like running off and like getting off the pill immediately, especially if you're really concerned about that or if you did have a really negative experience. But one of the things you can do is start, maybe work with a practitioner, find yourself a naturopath or functional doctor or, someone who can support you in this. Start working on some of those things, reducing your exposure to inflammatory foods, increasing your consumption of anti-inflammatory foods, looking at like basically a dietary and supplemental program that can help to like really lower that inflammation, like that, because that's a big piece of this. It's not the only piece of it, but it's a really big piece of it. So if you can kind of start doing that, let's say 2 to 3 months while you're still on it, then at least you're giving yourself the best case scenario that when you actually come off of it, you've been working on this for a couple months, that maybe it'll be a bit more tolerable. And then one of the things that I've learned through the interviews, as I mentioned, the interview with the surgeon, is that if you do think that you have endo and you are at that point where you're like, you know what, I think I want to find out for sure. Because the hard thing about endo is that currently the most effective diagnosis is still laparoscopic surgery. So you could have an ultrasound and, an MRI and kind of come up a little like clean or whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have it. And so for both diagnosis and actually, removal, it's really important for you to just strongly consider finding a surgeon who specializes in endo or even only does endo surgeries. Because what I learned from some of the interviews I've done is that I interviewed this one woman and it was really interesting because she had endo like all over. And she had a laparoscopic surgery and they kind of told her she was okay. And that was because the surgeon wasn't experienced. And so he wasn't able to, like, even though he was looking at it, he didn't know what he was looking at, because he didn't have enough experience. So that has implications for accurate diagnosis, even if you get the surgery, plus also the recurrence rate. So there's different ways to do the surgery. And there's plenty of women who do surgery and it comes back. And so that would be huge. To really take the time. Don't just go under the scalpel. Don't just let the random doctor who like does like 2 endo surgeries a year, like find the person who really specializes in this, like for whom this is what they do and they really know what they're talking about.
Lisa, I want to thank you so much for all of the work you do and for coming on Slut today. And your work has really changed my life, truly. So I want to ask you one last question before we go. What is something that you would like listeners to take away from this conversation or fertility awareness in general that is the most important?
That's a good question. I feel like if I think about the takeaway, it's just that you have the power to decide what it is you're going to do. You don't have to listen to anyone else's opinions. You can make that decision, whether that decision aligns with what we talked about today or whether it doesn't, right? So whichever way you want to go, it's really up to you. And if you don't like what you're being told and you have a feeling, even if it's just a feeling that the person who you're talking to doesn't know what they're talking about, just lean into that. There's always other options.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. This was so great. This was a lot of fun.
Sluts, I hope you learned something today and that you now feel more empowered to make the best choice for your health, whatever that may be. Thank you, Lisa, for coming on the show. It was such a pleasure to have you. You can listen to Lisa's podcast, Fertility Friday, wherever, and find her on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Fertility Friday. If you have a slutty story or fantasy, call or text 910-745-SLUT. That's 910-745-SLUT, and tell me about it to be featured in the last episode of the season. Sluts, make sure you're subscribed to the show and rate it 5 stars. Share the show with a friend or on your social media. Make sure you're following at Caitlin Dryden and at Slut Podcast on Instagram and at SlutPod on TikTok. But the L is an I to stop me from being shadow banned. Subscribe to my YouTube channel at Slut Podcast, even if you don't listen there. It's really important to do this so the show can find more sluts like us. If you'd like to purchase a slut sticker pack, go to slut-pod.com. That's slut-pod.com. Links to all these and more are in the description to this episode. Slut is created and hosted by me, Caitlin Dryden. This episode was also edited and engineered by me. Graphics are by Keisha Gargarello. The song is by me, but with help from Michael Mason and Corinne Davis. And thank you for getting slutty with me. Let's meet here same time next week, okay? Bye, sluts!